The following video is sponsored by Skillshare. Huge thanks to them for making this video possible. The iPhone 5C was so close to being something truly spectacular. A phone that would not only profit Apple, but make sense for the average consumer and be the go-to smartphone for most people. In turn, this would increase Apple's market share, as well as their popularity among buyers. But the iPhone 5C wasn't that. It was unfortunately seen as an overpriced plastic iPhone 5, and for good reason, because it was. This is a phone that I've called the worst iPhone ever, but what I didn't talk about is how darn close it was to being one of the best. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're talking about how the iPhone 5C was almost brilliant. Perhaps I've beaten this subject to death, but every video I've done about the iPhone 5C tends to paint it in a negative light. So I wanted to do one that more highlighted some of the positives of the iPhone 5C, and more importantly, the lessons that Apple learned from their mistakes. But before we get into all that, we have a quick word from today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an amazing online learning community with thousands of classes covering pretty much anything you can imagine. Personally, I've been going through some of the photography lessons. I want to up my B-roll game, and Skillshare is the perfect service to help me do that. A premium membership gives you unlimited access to any class you're interested in and is incredibly affordable. An annual subscription will cost you less than $10 a month. If you're intrigued, you can sign up with the top link in the description and get a 2-month free trial. Skillshare is a very cool website, and I hope you at least consider giving the free trial a shot. We could all use a little bit more creativity and learning in our lives, and Skillshare is the way to make that happen. Again, top link of the description for a free 2-month trial. Big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and let's rewind back to 2013. 2013. Two phones came out this year, the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 5C. These two phones had been heavily rumored ahead of time, and although not every detail was known at the time, people had the general picture. This was the first time ever Apple would launch two phones at the same time, and they couldn't be more different. The iPhone 5S retained the largely popular square aluminum design with glass antenna bands on the back. It brought a new gold color and had a very premium feel to it, as well as, of course, Touch ID. With the addition of iOS 7, the 5S felt like a big upgrade despite the change in looks. The internal specs were nothing to scoff at as well. It had the first 64-bit architecture of any smartphone and was miles ahead of the competition, which is probably why it was supported by iOS all the way until late 2019 with iOS 12. The iPhone 5C, on the other hand, went a completely different direction. It replaced the iPhone 5 and looked wildly different, but kept all the internals. On a technical level, it was essentially the same phone, with a few varying differences here and there, but for the most part it was a repackaged iPhone 5. The design of the phone was completely the opposite, however, being polycarbonate plastic and bringing a ton of different colors in hopes to appeal to a broader audience. It's always annoyed me when people say, Steve Jobs never would have done that when talking about something Apple does, because honestly, how would you know? If you're not Steve Jobs, you probably didn't know him. But I do think it's fairly safe to say, based on how Steve Jobs worked and a lot of the products he put out, the iPhone 5C probably would not have happened under his reign. It didn't move anything forward, it dropped the premium nature of iPhones, and brought a varying color palette that wasn't really normal back in the day, especially for Apple. You also didn't really get a lot of color options in smartphones back in 2013 unless you went for a cheaper phone, which the 5C wasn't. Apple had actually made some plastic phones before, namely the iPhone 3G and the iPhone 3GS, but this is when iPhones were kind of still in their infancy, and it all changed with the iPhone 4. While plastic felt less premium, it's important to note that this was intentional. Apple wanted clear distinction between the iPhone 5C and the iPhone 5S, and colors plus plastic was kind of the easiest way to do that. If Apple had done what they did in the past, as in just release a single phone in the iPhone 5S and keep the iPhone 5 around at a lower price, there would have been very little to differentiate the two phones. Many would opt for the slightly cheaper iPhone 5. After all, it looks exactly like the 5S, therefore it is the same, right? Obviously not, but in the mind of consumers, that's what they'll often think. My guess is that Apple had probably experienced this with the iPhone 4S previously. The 4S looked exactly like the iPhone 4, so a lot of people probably bought the iPhone 4 instead of the 4S just because they looked the same. The 5C replacing the iPhone 5 was actually a pretty decent remedy to this, because not only was there more distinction in differing models, but it allowed them to reduce production costs. The iPhone 5 wasn't cheap to make, and if I had to guess, it probably didn't cost much less to Apple than the iPhone 5S. This meant a less savings for Apple, and without a price reduction, the iPhone 5 obviously wouldn't sell, so it just didn't make sense from a financial standpoint. Keep in mind this is conjecture, I don't know how much the iPhone 5 costed to produce versus the 5S, but I think it's fair to say, considering they're very similar, it probably wasn't much less. So the 5C opted to be a cheaper option to the 5S, both for Apple and for the consumer. The problem here is that while the iPhone 5C was indeed cheaper than the 5S, it wasn't by enough. If you were to buy a phone outright unlocked, the 5S would run you $650. This sounds cheap by today's standards, but it was one of the most expensive options back in 2013. It would make sense for people to look for a cheaper option, and if you wanted to buy the iPhone C outright, it would cost you $550. $100 cheaper for an assumedly significantly cheaper phone to produce. Apple should have knocked it down to $450 or even $500, but instead they were greedy, and that right there is why the iPhone 5C ended up failing. Had the iPhone 5 stuck around, it would have been the exact same price of $550, which made this phone feel pointless. Who wants a phone that was exactly like the iPhone 5, but plastic instead of aluminum? In the minds of the consumer, even back in 2013, plastic meant cheap. A big reason back then a lot of people went for iPhone in the first place is because a lot of other companies such as Samsung during this time did plastic phones. The 5C was exactly what people were trying to avoid when they were buying from Apple. And again, this would have been okay if the 5C was a budget phone, but it wasn't. We'll come back to the iPhone 5C in a moment. A main thought here is the rationale behind Apple's choices, even if they were executed poorly. The iPhone 5 was expensive to manufacture, meaning Apple didn't want to sell it at a reduced price. Cut to 2018 and Apple did the exact same thing. The iPhone XR replaced the iPhone X simply because the iPhone X was expensive to make and it didn't make sense to just reduce the price. Plus, most people would have bought the X over the XS. And why not? After all, they looked the same. These two situations parallel each other extremely closely. The biggest difference is pretty major though, and that's that the XR was actually a good phone. And as a result, it was the best-selling iPhone. While the XR had colors, it was still feeling premium, thanks to the glass, even if the frame was aluminum instead of stainless steel. Where Apple reduced the price mostly was in the display. And while people complained about it at launch, the people who complained about it weren't the target audience. For the average consumer, since the XR came out, it was the best value phone you could buy, at least on the iPhone side. And now, with the iPhone 11 coming out, the same thing has happened, and again, that's the phone you should buy if you consider yourself to be an average Joe, which, I mean, if you're watching this video, you probably don't, but point stands. So, the iPhone XR and the 5C, very similar, but not quite. The XR was $250 cheaper than the iPhone XS, while the 5C was only $100 cheaper than the 5S. And this year, the iPhone 11 is only $699. That's a pretty good deal. Not only this, but the XR is actually slightly bigger than the XS, making it a better buy for some people. Maybe you want that perfect in-between size phone between the XS and XS Max, and the XR is exactly that. The 5C had the iPhone 5's internal specs and camera, while the XR shares most of its similarities with the iPhone XS. Same camera, although only one lens, but who cares. Same chipset, although slightly less RAM. In my eyes, the iPhone XR was the iPhone 5C perfectly executed, and exactly what the 5C should have been. And the iPhone 11, I think, is going to be the exact same thing. But that doesn't mean that the 5C didn't come close to being this. All these things I've said have worked for the XR were so darn close to making the 5C a success, and that's why I consider it to be almost brilliant. It did a lot of things right, at least in theory, and it's easy to see Apple's logic in a lot of their decision making, even if they ended up making the wrong decisions, such as the price point. Ideally, they should have given the iPhone 5C the iPhone 5's processor, as the 5S's processor was a big upgrade, but the iPhone 5S's camera. The 5S wasn't a huge camera upgrade over the iPhone 5 anyways, but it could have been a big selling point. Even though the cameras weren't that much better, you could market it as having the iPhone 5S camera, and that would have pulled a lot more people. Despite people equating plastic to cheap, I actually would have kept the plastic on the 5C 5C. Equating the 5C to cheap could actually work in Apple's favor, as long as the price tag matched that mindset. Personally, I would have set the price point at $500. This would have made it $150 cheaper than the iPhone 5S, which is close to what the XR was, being $250 cheaper than the iPhone XS. $500 still seems expensive, considering the 5S was only $650, but Apple would have showed it as $499, and all of a sudden that number seems a lot better. A good example of why rounding it down to $499 is a good idea is the iPhone 11 this year. They went from $750 to $699, and that price point sounds way better even though it's only $50 cheaper. If the 5C had done the same thing, people would have received it much better. So for $499, you would have gotten, sure, a plastic phone, but the 5S camera with the iPhone 5 internals. That sounds a lot better than what the 5C actually turned out to be. And keep in mind, while the iPhone 5C had its problems, it still did sell extremely well, just not in Apple terms. It sold more in a year than most flagships do nowadays, with Forbes estimating 24 million units sold by the June of 2014. That's not even a full year of being on sale. Apple expects a lot from their iPhone sales, and they sell a lot, and the 5C didn't quite match up to what they normally would have sold. The 5C didn't sell good enough, and for that reason, Apple didn't try it again until the iPhone XR. I mean, unless you count the iPhone SE as being kind of similar. Just a quick tangent here, because I've talked about this before. The iPhone SE was essentially the iPhone 5C 2.0, with the XR being the 5C 3.0. That might seem confusing, but I do think it makes sense. The SE wasn't an upgrade when it launched, but it appealed to those in the market for a cheaper iPhone. It replaced the aging 5S and was released 6 months after the iPhone 6S. It had mostly the same specs as the 6S at a significantly reduced price, making it the best budget buy for a long time. The parallels aren't as obvious as they are with the XR, but the SC was essentially what the 5C was trying to be, a budget option to the best iPhone. I think the iPhone 5C is exactly what Apple needed in 2013. The 5C was a huge step forward internally, but the design was too similar to the iPhone 5, so it made sense to get rid of the 5 from the lineup, just like they've gotten rid of the iPhone 10 and now the 10s from the lineup because the iPhone 10s and the 11 Pro are too similar to the previous year's models. But back in 2013, you still needed another budget phone option that was better than the iPhone 4S, and if the iPhone 5 couldn't be that, then you needed a whole new phone to do it. Unfortunately, the 5C's price was just too high. Of course, Apple kept the 5C around for years, and it eventually did become more popular as it got cheaper, but Apple reduced the minimum storage to 8 gigabytes eventually, which was a terrible amount of space even back then, making the 5C just a horrible choice. You can blame it on greed, but at the end of the day, the iPhone 5C was really just an experiment that didn't go the way Apple wanted it to. Apple did manage to learn from their mistakes with it, and this has resulted in some of their best phones ever released with the iPhone SE, XR, 11. The rationale and thought process behind the iPhone 5C was right, just poorly executed. And that's why the iPhone 5C was almost brilliant. And with that, I think I'm pretty much done here. Do you agree with me? Disagree with me? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason. And don't forget to check out Skillshare, top link in the description. Big thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.